So for this video Bible study, I want to introduce our topic through a quote from T.S. Eliot. He says, "No poet or no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone." That is the author. You must set the author that you are looking at among the dead. You must compare and contrast his work among those who have gone before. And if you're reading the New Testament, this is certainly the case, because no New Testament author is alone on an island. They're all, in a sense, completely and utterly dependent on the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the traditions of the time, and everything that they're writing is sort of a commentary on that. Even the way that the gospel authors are retelling the story of Jesus' life and death and resurrection is alluding back to the Old Testament. I was talking with someone a week or so ago, and he was working on the recommendation that you can't understand the New Testament without fully understanding the Old Testament, so he was beginning to read the entire Old Testament before really digging into the New Testament. Now, that may have some issues there, because the New Testament can be read on its own and understood, but he's absolutely right that you're going to miss a lot of the dependence and the literary allusions back to the Old Testament. These authors, it was in their bones, like deeply embedded in their understanding of religion and faith and following God. And we see that. In the pages of the New Testament, there's probably a direct citation to the Old Testament a couple of times. I saw one stat that said every 22 and a half verses you can find a citation, a direct citation to the Old Testament. That's not even talking about what are called echoes or allusions, these sort of hooks that can take you back into the literary world of the text. As we look at the book of Psalms, this plays out. The New Testament authors loved the book of Psalms, and for today, as we're observing Good Friday, I thought a great place for us to hang out would be in Psalm 22. Psalm 22 begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you don't answer, by night, but I find no rest." These are the first couple of verses of Psalm 22, and the first phrase we hear on the lips of Jesus in Matthew and Mark's retelling of the crucifixion. In fact, in chapter 27 of the book of Matthew, it describes this scene. It says, "From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all of the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, 'Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani,' which in Aramaic is a translation of this Hebrew line in Psalm 22, which is pronounced Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. So close, and Hebrew and Aramaic, they're related languages. But here we see Jesus pronouncing this psalm. Now, it's interesting because in Luke and John, this is not the case. If memory serves, I believe it's just in Matthew and Mark. So the way that the gospel authors are describing Jesus' death, it's different. As we've talked about before at TRP, it's shaped history. It is the authors attempting to provide a theological retelling of Jesus' life and death and resurrection for the benefit of their audience. But at least for two of the gospel authors, this was an important line. Now, my point in this video is not to dig into Psalm 22 and to describe what it means. Some folks would say here that a good way to read what Jesus is doing is not to see this as a pity party on the cross, but to see this as I believe Brueggemann would call this a legal psalm, a psalm that is attempting to make God remain faithful to the things that God is supposed to be faithful to. And here, at least as Jesus is uttering these words, it's be faithful to the work that I have done, that you have said is your work here. Now, if you really want to dig into it, a great place to hang out would be The Crucified God by Jürgen Moltmann. It is a deep rich understanding that a large swath of the church has been not allowed to see. It's basically putting Jesus in the place of the suffering God, which is important, and how there's links between the suffering of Jesus and the suffering of people in this world. It's a powerful work, and I would recommend it to you. But here we have in Matthew 27 a direct citation of Psalm 22, and that's well known. What you might not also know is that the author of this book seems to be dependent upon Psalm 22 in a much wider framework. For example, in Psalm 22, verses 6 and 7, it says, "I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their head." A distinct phrase here that we see embedded within Matthew's retelling of the death of Jesus. In verses 39 and 40 of the same chapter, chapter 27, it says, "Those who passed by hurled insults at Jesus, shaking their heads and saying, 'You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself.'" So here we see some of this lines from Psalm 22. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. Matthew 27, they pass by, hurling insults at him, shaking their heads. We also have in Psalm 22, verse 8, "He trusts in the Lord," they say. "Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." So this is a text that is seemingly saying, there's taunts of the people that are saying, this person trusts in the Lord, let the Lord rescue him. In Matthew 27, we see similar verbiage happening here. In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders, they mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God." Some of the same lines here from the Psalm. "Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" So the same sort of ideas from the Psalm are coming through in Matthew chapter 27. And this would not be a direct citation. There's no chapter and verse, so to speak, in Matthew's retelling, but it's understood that his audience would be moving back to Psalm 22, especially with the use of the Psalm on the lips of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some people, in fact, would say that for ancient readers, it just takes a line for an entire context to be remembered. I'm sure there's an example of that in our current moment, but I don't have one off the top of my head. Christians also like to use the following verse from Psalm 22. It says, "Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet," which sounds a lot like crucifixion. Now, the problem with this is, in the Hebrew text, it actually says, "like a lion at my hands and feet." And then in the translations of the Hebrew text is where we start getting more language of "they're piercing my hands and feet," which are more clearly sort of a crucifixion term. So in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and I believe in the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible, we start seeing some more crucifixion type language here. So I'm not so sure that that's a great one, just because there's some questions as to what is the best lines from the Psalm in its original context. We do have this last line here from Psalm 22, verse 18. "They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." And then in Matthew 27, when they crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Now, for a lot of folks, what you want to say is, this is fulfillment of the Old Testament, and Matthew is acknowledging that. It might be more beneficial for us to say Matthew is shaping this story with allusions back to Psalm 22. And Matthew is wanting his audience to see the death of Jesus in light of this psalm. I think it's important, at least for us, to understand that when these folks were writing the Bible, they had so many influences and so many things to pull from in their own tradition. And the important part for the New Testament authors is everything that they knew in their Hebrew Bible was now being reinterpreted in the light of Jesus, in his life, death, and resurrection, because that has been the event that has changed absolutely everything. Now, again, for a lot of Christians, we like to make sure that these are all historical and prophetic fulfillments of certain things. But the New Testament authors seem to be doing something a lot different. What they're doing is saying the lenses through which I'm reading the Old Testament is Jesus. It's a Jesus lens. And the stories and the way in which I'm now telling them, they've got hooks in the Old Testament, because if we understand, for example, Psalm 22, then we're going to understand something about Jesus and his death in this particular text. So we're going to throw the words of Psalm 22 on the screen. It's a little long, but given the fact that today is Good Friday, I think it would benefit all of us. Matthew certainly saw importance for us to know this psalm and to be wrestling with it as we consider the death of Jesus. And while I got you, I'll also say this too. We have recorded a Stations of the Cross production, I guess you can say. It's 22 minutes. Just throw in some earbuds and consider the last hours of the life of Jesus, especially on a day like today.